Hi, everyone, and welcome to Reimagine Agriculture, the podcast where we explore the future of farming, food, and rural life across Europe through the eyes of the people shaping it. I'm Teresa Carvalho, and in this series, we'll meet people from across Europe who are reshaping the future of agriculture. In this episode, we'll be talking to Sebastian Parel, a senior policy advisor from CEJA, the European Council of Young Farmers. Sebastian has a background in European affairs and a deep understanding of agricultural policies and how they affect young farmers across Europe. Hi, Sebastian.
Hi.
Could you tell us a bit about CEJA for our listeners who might not be familiar with your organization? What exactly do you do, and how does CEJA represent and defend the interests of young farmers across Europe?
Yes, hello, and thanks for having me. So CEJA, as you rightly mentioned, is the European Council of Young Farmers. We are the EU representation of young farmers thanks to a network of 34 member organizations that are the National Young Farmers Association, and they cover 21 member states of the EU, but we also go beyond the EU borders because now we have associate members from the UK, from Serbia, and from Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that's CEJA in brief and in its structure, but the mission, the main role of CEJA is really to be the link between young farmers and their associations at national level and what's happening at EU level on policy, but also on project aspect, on communication, training opportunities. But let's say that my area is really on the policy aspects, but it's also complemented by other elements.
Wow. So you work closely with politicians and EU officials in your day-to-day life, I'm assuming. So from your point of view, do you feel like young farmers are being treated as a real priority in current EU agricultural policies? Do you feel that politicians and policymakers genuinely listen to their concerns? And has it improved in recent years, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
Well, it's always fun to show that you're speaking with young farmers, that you can take pictures with them, go on their farm, because CEJA as an organization has built quite some legitimacy over the years. We were founded in 1958, so we've been around for quite some time. The organization started with the 6 founding countries of the EU, and then it evolved together with the evolution of the EU. So there's the representativity aspect that I mentioned before and the historical aspect. Then it's also based on the daily work that we're doing, having an organization as professionalized as possible. So are we treated as a priority? I would say at the moment, yes, in the sense that a few days ago, we had the publication of Strategy for Generational Renewal in Agriculture, which is quite an important piece for us, quite an important document. So we've been raising the issue of young farmers and generational renewal for decades. Usually when we ask us when did it come really on the EU agenda, we tend to say early 2000s started to become really a real element. Then when we look in the CAP, it's been 2 reforms now that we have instruments that are specifically targeted at young farmers. And now, as I was saying, with the strategy, we see that we have an opportunity to go a bit beyond, not just for the sake of speaking about young farmers, but because there is an urgency. I don't know to what extent you want me to elaborate on the figures, but the figures are quite worrying. The average age is 57 in the EU. We have only 6.5% of EU farmers that are below the age of 35. So yeah, it's a topic that is widely discussed. For us, it's about bringing as many inputs as possible on what concretely is missing in terms of policy, why attracting young farmers is still a major challenge, and has it improved? So the declining number of farmers and of farms is still a worrying one. We see, and maybe we can have an opportunity to discuss further later on, but we have now some specific instruments on young farmers. So we had some victory as an organization, but some work is still to be done. Again, the declining number of farmers, the curve is not reversed. So we still need to speak with politicians, as you say. We still have a lot of interactions with different institutions at EU level, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council, but also other institutions, other representations, and also stakeholders, because we usually say that speaking about young farmers is not just about the public policy, it's also about functioning value chains. How do we interact with the other actors that are part of our food system?
You can clearly see that an aging farming population is such a big challenger. And at the same time, agriculture is facing other crises. I mean, from climate change, unfair competition, rising food prices, supply chain disruptions, and also geopolitical uncertainty. And all of this is putting growing pressure on the agri-food sector. So I feel like I wanted to ask, from your experience, what are the main challenges that young farmers and new entrants face today?
Yes. So without any surprise, we always bring the same elements, and every time we test with our membership again to see what do you face as challenges, we always come back to the same issue, which is also reassuring on what we have in our position papers. But of course, as a backdrop, you have the element of the profitability and the economic aspect. But then when we look at specific issues for young farmers, and when you have to start in the sector, it goes back to the issues of access to land, because land is not always available, it's very expensive, you have not always good transparency on farmland markets. So this always comes back as one of the first elements. The second one is really on the financial aspect, the access to finance, access to credits. We have quite some good data now that is gathered, for example, by the Fee Compass agency, with some work being done by DG Agri together with the European Investment Bank, that shows that there is clearly a financing gap in the agricultural sector. And this financing gap, so the unmet demand for loans, for example, is higher for young farmers. We have such figures, and this is because it is, of course, a capital-intensive sector. When you have to buy a new farm with the house, with some land, with the machinery, with the equipment, and so on. But it's also, we hear it from our young farmers, it's also linked, for example, to the perception of agriculture. If agriculture is not positively perceived as a sector for the future, then you don't necessarily have the trust from the investors' point of view and from the banks to follow the project. So that's the second element, access to credit. Then we go more on the, as I was saying, the value chain aspect, the income aspect. How do we fight against unfair trading practices? Because this is something that is still happening. And also, how do we share the responsibility facing sustainability transition? But also when it comes to market volatility, what's the role of farmers? What's the role of the actors? What's the role of public authorities? So that third element would be on value chain. Another one is knowledge and skills. We tend to say that young farmers tend to be more educated, but still, when we look at EU-wide figures, there's still a lot of progress that can be done because it's such a highly technical profession. Again, when we speak with our young farmers, they often tell us, I'm an agronomist, I'm also an environmentalist, I'm a lawyer because I have to deal with legislation, I deal with human resources because I have employees, I need to communicate, I need to negotiate with my contractors, and so on and so forth. Quite a lot of skills. So the question is, how do we work with this in terms of basic education, but also then lifelong learning? What's the role of advisory services also in the CAP, for example? So that's quite an important element. Maybe, and I could continue for forever, so we try to summarize, but another one is more on the farming is not only the profession, it's also about the living conditions. And for example, the living conditions in rural areas. How do we ensure what we would call the right to stay in rural areas? How do we look at agriculture in the broadest perspective? What are the services? We had our vice president from Sweden, Elizabeth Hedden. She's a young dairy farmer. She already told the commissioner for agriculture, why should I have to choose between my cows and kids? And she was explaining she has 1 hour drive to go to the first childcare center. So that's the type of elements that we also consider. How about mental health? How about work-life balance aspect? Because we see that, so there are the very structural challenges that I mentioned, but it's also linked to how agriculture is competed by other sectors. Am I attracted because maybe in other sectors I can have a position with less uncertainty, with a good salary, not taking risks. So it's not only about looking at agriculture per se. It's also about looking at the broader picture of agriculture between other sectors and other opportunities in life. But we need to have agriculture there to provide opportunities for young people, because at the end of the day, we will always need people to be in the sector.
Thank you for an amazing answer. You already mentioned several challenges, but how do you think the Common Agricultural Policy, as the backbone of EU agricultural support, can help farmers to address those challenges in particular? We already know it provides farmers with a range of tools to stay competitive, provide high quality products, and address upcoming challenges. What would you say to that?
So the CAP is still a very important tool for young farmers. When we ask them, it's a very structural policy. It's a very important EU policy. So it's quite an important piece. It's not making it's not responding to all obstacles, all challenges, obviously, otherwise it would be a magic solution, but it's still an important element. So as you say, for example, the fact that you have several elements in it, like income support aspect for what it comes to the economic safety nets that you would need. But then it's also steering the certain transitions with the green architecture. It's obviously not perfect. We have lots of things to say, but there is also this element, the rural development aspect and specific measures also for young farmers, for example, at the moment in the Pillar 2 of the CAP. So how do we see the role of the CAP? One, when it comes to young farmers specifically, as I was saying, it's been 2 reforms that we managed to get specific support for young farmers. And of course, we could get the question, why should young farmers get more or specific or more targeted support? The answer is in what I was saying just before, that you have a different perspective when you start, when you have to think things 20 years or 30 years ahead, because you're still going to be in the sector, or you hope you will still be in the sector in 30 years. So this will require certain targeted measures. So at the moment, we have a certain top-up. So the CAP member states have to spend, for example, minimum 3% of their envelope of direct payments on young farmers' instruments. Before it was up to 2% in the reform before. Now, since 2023, it's 3% minimum, and they can go beyond. And what we see is that it's good in the sense that it provides a top-up, for example, on income support, whether it is when it's an area-based support of Pillar 1. But then what is very interesting is the possibility for member state to transfer that money to the second pillar to finance and also co-finance with national money instruments that are very good for young farmers, such as installation aid. So really having a big push at the very first years of your installation, because this is the moment where you have a lot of investments to make. You need a certain financial capacity to go in front of your banker. So this is really the first years where you are really in need for such a financial support. And then you also have the possibility for investment support top-up. So having a higher percentage of the investment that is covered when you are a young farmer. It helps. It also comes with certain challenges. For example, availability of the money when you have too many applicants. Also, such measures will not solve the issue of access to land, for example. It's not by subsidizing that you are giving facilitated access to land. So it's not solving everything, but it helps to a certain extent. And that's why we are here as an organization, to explain what we need, why this is useful, and why we need to keep those instruments.
So having said that, what changes would you like to see in the CAP to make opportunities more accessible? How could the CAP support a new generation of farmers in a better way?
First, maybe not having too much of a big change would help, because now with the proposals that were unveiled on the 16th of July 2025, we have quite some concerns about the future of the CAP for after 2027. The first reason is really on the governance of the CAP. Now we have a full reshuffle of the governance of such a structural policy. Of course, the European Commission maintained a dedicated legislation, so a separate CAP regulation. but at the same time having agriculture that would be part of this broader national and regional partnership plans brings quite a lot of worries among our network. This is linked to quite some uncertainty on how this new governance system will work. This is linked also to the budgetary aspects, because we would have a budget that is ring-fenced but with less money compared to the previous cap. But then it's also about very specifically our young farmers instruments. So now we have a cap that is ring-fenced within the NRP, so the fund as it is called. But then when we go into the CAP, we don't have any provision for a minimum spending on young farmers. What I was mentioning, the 3%, we don't have them anymore, despite having some communications, including in the strategy for generational renewal, that member states should spend minimum 6% on young farmers. So as a consequence for us, it was quite tricky to take as a proposal, because we saw quite some interesting proposals in terms of instruments within the CAP regulations, which would fit some of our expectations. For example, when it comes to young farmers instruments, we had developed our position paper. It took 2 years to really go in depth into the topic with our members and explain young farmers instruments should go beyond what the 3 elements we have at the moment. It's also about advising letters. Maybe it's also about climate diagnosis when you're starting. Maybe it's also about mediation services, because you also have lots of emotional aspects besides the financial ones and so on. Having a one-stop shop principle for when you have to ask a question, when you are willing to install. So those are things that were taken. Also on other aspects, quite some interesting elements. But on the other hand, the fact that we could not secure the budget for it is creating a lot of concerns, because now we're not having the EU leverage to ensure that member states are doing what they should. And we're also leaving our own members alone facing their government. And some of them have right access to the table of negotiation, but some others will not have such a preferential access, and therefore where they would not be able to express what they need for those future NRPPs, the national and regional partnership plans. So what do we want? Hard to summarize. It's a more than 45 pages document that I would be happy to share. You can find it on our website. We structure it around the competitiveness and the income aspect, then green architecture, then the more rural and territorial approach, and finally back to the core business of CIJA, the young farmers instruments. How can we improve installation aid? How can we have better cooperation measures in the CAP, and so on? But again, the big fight for the coming weeks and months will be on securing that budget and having it not just as an aspirational target, as a strategy, but something that would really be enshrined in the legal text, because otherwise we cannot have certainty on the next years to come.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit, having spoken with young farmers from all over Europe, you must have a really good sense of the realities they face, depending on where they're from. What kind of differences do you think young farmers face in terms of challenges and opportunities, for example, between Mediterranean and northern countries in Europe?
Yes, indeed, there's a diversity of challenge. The ones I mentioned so far were really like the horizontal ones faced by everyone. But if you mention Mediterranean countries, of course, when it comes to water availability, for example, this is a topic that they are raising more and more. Ahead of the European elections of 2024, we had our manifesto for the EU elections, where we focused it on generational renewal and trying to make a list of 10 points that are to be considered. And actually the water aspect, climate change aspect, was really in there, because in Southern Europe, our members are telling us if we don't have availability of water, this is also putting at stake the future of young farmers and having young farmers able to do this activity. So we clearly link it more and more directly to the generational renewal element. So we can have diversity of challenges because of the climate aspects, so the pedoclimatic aspects, whether the soil's condition and so on. So that's the case for, as I was saying, water. Maybe at the moment we're discussing about the water resilience strategy. Of course, you would have certain member states with more of the, again, availability issue, and some others will have constraints regarding the water quality, linked to the habitat directives, to the nitrate directive, to the water framework directive. So those are topics that we also discuss, and it's always, even if the challenge is different, it's always interesting to have such an exchange of good practice or exchange of practices, because then one can understand what is the issue of a counterpart in other parts of the EU. Then maybe a different view could also not only be the climatic aspect and the region element, but also on certain traditions, certain views, or certain national legislations. If you take the topic of land, you have certain member states where you have very strong national rules on a ceiling on the price of land, very strong market regulation for farmland. So you would all obviously have a different perspective. It's also linked to history. Speaking about land in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe is very different, because you have countries in the East that inherited from the post-communism, post-Soviet Union period. Obviously, the perception is different. So it's also this quite fascinating job being in CIJA. It's about dealing with that diversity. When we have also farm visit, because the way we work is having one meeting in presence at least per month, besides some online calls. And once in a while, it's not always in Brussels. We also go on farm visits when it's one of our members hosting. Obviously, it's not the same where you visit a pasture-based system in Ireland and then you go to the south of Andalusia in Spain. But at the same time, it's quite important to have this exchange and to have CIJA working as a platform to understand this diversity of challenges.
And when it comes to CAP national strategic plans, do you see any differences in how different member states support young farmers?
Yes, first, they are the ones that stick to the minimum of 3% and those going beyond the 3%. Then it's from really on the analysis of links between the measure and the outcome and the statistic. For example, Austria is the one scoring the best with 24% of farmers below 40 years old. It's still quite a big piece of work to manage to make the good link with the policies that are in place. So there's the budgetary ambition aspect, and then on the choice of instruments, it can also be different. Some member states are only going for the top-up on income support in Pillar 1. Some are transferring all the money to the Pillar 2 for installation aid. So as a consequence, it can be quite different. It's also different in the sense that in certain member states, like in Spain or in France, the management of the second pillar is at regional level. So you even have differences at regional level, not only from national level to national levels. So on the choice, we tend to favor instruments such as installation aid, investment support, also the use of financial instruments. So meaning having public money, so from the second pillar fund, to leverage additional private money with commercial banks. And this is, for example, not the case in every member state. So it's also about making sure we explain how those instruments are working, not only us, but also the institutions that are in charge. We cannot do all the work because of capacity, but also then see if there's really a need to have such instruments that will be replicated somewhere else.
Thank you. Our podcast has many young listeners in Greece and Belgium. In Greece, there isn't really a strong or well-organized young farmers movement at the moment. What do you think about that? And according to your experience, how can networks like CIJA help young farmers influence CAP instruments and ensure that their needs are represented at both the EU and national levels?
Yeah, so we used to have a member in Greece some time ago, but before I arrived in CIJA 4 years ago. So I think it was way before. But from my understanding, this couldn't work also because of financial reasons. And as you pointed out, it's not a strong and well-organized young farmers movement. So really about the capacity building of such a movement, which is a pity because we would be glad to have more countries represented in CIJA. So indeed, Greece is not a country that is at the moment represented in CIJA. How do I look at this and how can CIJA help for the second question you were asking? First of all, it sounds very generic and very basic, but having as many contacts as possible with certain young farmers that would be in countries where we don't have a member also with certain institutions, with the ministries for agriculture, with the permanent representation in Brussels of those countries. But then very concretely as CIJA, what has been launched 3 years ago is a 3-day training that is called the EU Young Farmers Leadership Program. It's 3 days of training for young farmers, young leaders in agriculture on how to represent the sector, how to build an organization, how to manage the budget of such an association, how do I deal with a conflict that I would have in the board of such an organization. If I have a staff, how do I work on the complementarity between elected young farmers and staff and so on. And for this, we want to open it to more than CIJA members, which means that we don't have a member, for example, at the moment in Croatia either, but last time we have someone from Croatia. We had participants from Bulgaria. It's also a member state that is missing for us. But with this training, we can have an entry door to CIJA. And even if the organization is not necessarily completely set up, it's a way to really connect young farmers from other countries we don't have yet with the CIJA family. And it works quite well. It's been only 3 years, but it's already quite a big success. We have already 3 promotions of 50 alumni of this training. So if we have Greek listeners to this podcast, I would encourage them also to look into this and to contact C if they are aware of any interested young farmer that would like to benefit from that program.
Yeah, hopefully they will. This has been a really fascinating conversation. And on a final note, what advice would you give to young Europeans who want to play an active role in shaping how the CAP is implemented in their countries? What practical steps can they take, and which networks should they engage with to make a real impact?
It might sound a bit philosophical or generic, but to dare in the sense that it's the most fascinating moment when you are presenting or preparing a discussion with them and you have in front of you so many nationalities of young farmers that are entrepreneurs that have their farm, they're very busy at home and they still take time to engage. And they're there in the sense that it's not always very comfortable when it comes to the technicalities of the file, because it's a lot about policy making. It's a very technical element to talk about EU policy in particular. Also, the language sometimes can be a barrier, but in the end, everyone can be understood and can express. So, and also there to share practical, very concrete anecdotes, examples from the farm level, if the question is mostly for young farmers. Then also, I would say it's also true for other young actors, that including the staff of such organizations, because we, in our membership, for example, we also have members which have a staff. But in general, yes, be aware that you are the farmer's representative and therefore you have something specific to bring, and you shouldn't mimic what other actors legitimately would do. For example, at some point we had very technical discussions on the new genomic techniques. It came to the genetic of plants and so on. And we decided to have a position paper, or the previous board of CIJA decided to. The idea was not to pretend to be a researcher. It was still to stay in the boots of, I shouldn't say this, but still stay in the boots of the farm and be the one explaining from the user perspective, what do I think? The same goes for example, we give the opportunity to our young farmers to sit in the expert group of the European Commission, the civil dialogue groups. Very often you enter, it's very formal setting, you have interpreters in their cabins, you have stakeholders making statements and so on. I try to reassure them and tell them, you really have something to say and don't be scared of that setting. It's about making sure that your voice is being heard in this type of network. So I would say, because you asked which type of network, I would say farmers organizations, of course, but also getting involved with the ministries at national level, at regional level, and any type of other opportunities that can arise. There's plenty, but connect with other young farmers is also quite a good way to advance on that topic.
Yeah, community is everything. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for sharing your insights with us today. It's clear that young farmers across Europe and the networks supporting them are not only shaping the future of agriculture, but also growing a stronger voice in policymaking. And to our listeners, if you're inspired to get involved or want to learn more about the work of CIJA, make sure to check out the networks in your countries and the resources that we've mentioned today. Thank you everyone for tuning into Reimagine Agriculture, part of the Recap Project, where we bring forward the voices helping to shape a more sustainable, inclusive, and community-driven future for European farming. See you next episode.